Yeah, I've got these things. I'm taping these things too, video-wise. So your handsome face is
Oh
there
God.
too. But if nothing else, I like to get the audio, scrape the audio off of
Gotcha.
this stuff and deal with this. But this is where my intern's going to come into play. I've got hours of this stuff right now, but I've been out of time getting everything done.
Yeah.
Oh well, it is what it is. Yeah, good morning everybody and welcome into the Q 96.5 FM. As we do on Tuesday mornings, we're talking education here today, and I have a guest right away, Mr. Tim Meister from the Fort County Career Center. Good to have you, Tim.
Thank you, Jim. Always a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity.
You know what? We started this out, and we were talking before we hit the microphone today as to people catching on, reactions, and everything that we're getting right now. And we hope that over the course of the next few weeks and months, that people tell other folks what we're trying to do, because what we try to do here most of the time is take on some issues that you don't hear or see every day. And I found it really interesting in the conversation that we had last time, and then also this time before we turned the mics on about how our politicians work. Okay, and how they do things and what they do, and we're all, it's no secret to anybody, but I think folks are finally starting to say, doggone it, are these guys really working for us all the time? Or are they just working on their own behalf? And I think it's time for all of us, me included, you included, anybody listening to this, to start thinking about some of the issues that really are causing some of our problems right now,
Yeah, absolutely. And, the really good ones, Jim, aren't concerned with what the other people in their party think or say. Mm-hmm. Or what the people in the opposite party think or say. They were elected to represent their constituents, and as we mentioned last time, you can go to any community in our Fort County area and probably any small town or rural area, take away, even maybe Toledo Public Schools, but the hub of every community is a school system.
Yes.
And when you don't protect one of your most valuable assets in a community, whether you're a politician or not a politician, you're making a grave mistake, because that eventually becomes the downfall of that culture in that community. So what we really need is those guys who are willing to take a stand and saying, I'm not making a backdoor deal. I'm not going to not vote for this, because if I do, you won't vote for this. We just need them to make good, logical decisions. And I know that's not how politics always work, but maybe it's time that it starts, because I think what we have seen with a shortage in the workforce, I think what we've seen with communities struggling to pass levies, those are communities where businesses begin to leave.
Yes.
And if your economic foundation begins to leave and your school system begins to struggle, then ultimately that will mean a struggle for your community. Yeah. And it just goes back to, like I said before, the hub of every community is the school system.
It definitely is. And we are so fortunate here to have the manufacturing that we have. There are huge cities around Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan that would absolutely pay millions of dollars to move our industry into their backyard.
Oh, absolutely. You have people like Spangler Canning Company, or like TrueFast, Ohio Art to some extent, that they're willing to not to sell their soul for the almighty dollar.
Yes.
They're willing to stay into their local community. That's very, very important to them, and they want to make sure that they are a huge part of that. So you're right, in Williams County especially, we're really fortunate.
Yeah, we really are, and it's so important, because today, Mary Leatherman will join us here today right after 10 o'clock, okay? And she will have a list of jobs around the area that need filled, all right? And they will be begging almost,
right?
Please come in and talk to us. Please, they don't want to show that when they come in. They don't want to talk that way because they're very positive and they take a very positive approach. But manufacturers around this area and businesses around this area are like businesses and manufacturers all around the country. They need people right now.
Yes, they really do. It's that skilled workforce and that skill set that I think the baby boomers, as they start to retire and they start to go out, their question is, do we have the number of skilled workers to replace them? Yes. The electricians, the plumbers, the tool and die makers, and those types of people. And so I just had an interesting conversation yesterday with Susan Wells, who's up in Toledo, who she had a somewhat of a roundtable summit with 4 superintendents and businesses. And she said, what's the single most important thing you think to closing the gap in our workforce shortage? And I said, it's very simple. I said, businesses and schools and communities got to become one. Sure. And we've got to provide kids with multiple viable pathways to success. And a couple of those have to be, you go into the workforce immediately after high school. You make a choice when you're your freshman or sophomore year that, you know what, maybe college isn't for me, but I can go to a career center, or I can take some college classes at Northwest State, and I can get a skill set. And I can get a skill, so when I walk out, I can make $40,000 or $50,000. And college may be an option down the road, and make that a pathway. Make going right into the workforce a pathway. Make going to college a pathway. But let's all work together and say there isn't just one way to success. There's multiple ways, and let's get together and present that as one strong voice.
Yeah, we're heading that way, don't you think?
I think so. I think we're getting there. I think the legislature is starting to put some decisions back into locals. I know our local superintendent in the Fort County area, they're tremendous. They have the same vision that I do, that college isn't the only way to success. And if we create a school system, which we kind of did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where the message is go to college or you're not successful, that creates some major issues in our workforce. And I know that the 22 that I work with, they are very open about we have to serve multiple and various different types of kids and situations, so we have to have multiple and various different types of pathways.
Yeah, Tim Meister is our guest right now from the Fort County Career Center, and he will join us about once a month here to chat a little bit about the issues on his side. I know that the state's hammering out a budget right now. And the federal guys are hammering out budgets. They all seem to hammer out budgets all the time.
Yeah.
And priorities change from year to year. What, from your perspective right now, how are we doing?
Well, it's really interesting because all of a sudden, when the budget is getting hammered out, Governor Kasich, his presidential run fails, and he based his presidential run on bringing jobs to Ohio, creating this massive rainy day fund, which is now in excess of $2 billion. And on his way out of being governor, all of a sudden we announced that we have like a $600 million or a $1.6 billion shortfall, and now I think it's up to a $2 billion shortfall. Yeah. And so they're trying to figure out who gets cut, what gets implemented. And this is a very interesting week. If you've not paid attention, it is very interesting this week because that budget has to be signed by June 30th.
Okay, all right.
And both the House and the Senate canceled their joint conference committees yesterday. So they have basically until the 29th that they have to get that budget into Governor Gasich's office, and then he's going to have to pick out what he's got a line item veto. For career tech wise, Jim, it's really interesting. So our career tech funding basically in a nutshell works like this. We are funded so much per student as the homeschools are. And the homeschools still receive some money if a student chooses to go to a career center like Fort County. Then we get what's called tiered funding. And what they've done is they've taken all the programs that career centers offer, and they've said, what's the most important one? And then they attach the most extra funding to that all the way down to what they think is the least important one. Okay. So you're getting funded per the student and then per the program that student is in. The Senate version takes that money and they lump it into one. So it doesn't matter what program they're in, you're only going to get so much per student. Where the House version maintains that tiered funding. And for us as career centers, I don't know why they would ever take away that tiered funding as an outside entity to the regular funding, because that's how we start new programs. That's how we update our equipment and things like that, because those important programs are saying there's a massive need for. We need to recruit kids in that program. We need to have the most up-to-date equipment, the most up-to-date technology, so when they walk out in the workforce, they're prepared. So for us as career centers, that's the thing that we're really looking at. Is a tiered funding going to stay within the guarantee, or is a tiered funding going to stay outside of it? Homeschools or associate schools, I think their big thing is a tangible personal property tax. That went out, and so they've introduced, they've not introduced, they've had it for a while, but it's basically known as the hold harmless. That they're not going to lose a bunch of funding. Career centers, we have never been allowed that hold harmless money, so we have lost all our TPP. But for associate schools, what happens with that, I think, is going to be a pretty big deal, too. So it's going to be a really interesting 3 days in Columbus.
How in the world are they going to cram all this together in 3 days?
Well, I think they have a majority in the foundation of that budget. Right now, here's what's going to come down to. Okay. What's important to those joint committees. Depending on who's on there, their sacred cows are going to get saved. The ones that aren't sacred to them are going to be first to get cut. And then when they get down to the nitty-gritty, they're going to start balancing funds. Okay, we're going to maintain this program, but we're not going to give it as much as we did last year. We're going to shift that money to here. I think the big difference this year, I think some of the money in education may not go towards education, or may not go towards maybe some higher education. It may not go towards a couple of different programs because the opiate problem has become so big. And everything that I have read, seen, and heard, they're going to put a massive amount of money towards fighting the opiate problem in Ohio. Yeah. So that, along with, I said, the shortfall of income that all of a sudden we find out about, those two things are really going to have an effect on anybody who receives any type of budgetary money from the state of Ohio.
What happened to the money? I have not been following it. Okay, you obviously watch it every day of the week. I'm with most of the folks that are on the sideline that thought we were doing well. We had, again, Governor Kasich, as he's running for president, we've got a huge surplus. Everything's going well. Things are good. What's the explanation that you're hearing right now for this to go the other way?
From my understanding, it's tax collections have come in lower than they thought, whether it be sales tax or income tax or property tax. They blame a little bit of it on decreased revenues in the casino because, they were pretty huge when they came in about 8 to 10 years ago. But quite honestly, what the casino revenue brings in and what the quote-unquote shortfall has been, Jim, I don't see that as a significant amount.
Sure.
I really don't. But those are the reasons we're being given. Again, but I'll go out to say that rainy day fund that he has created, which I believe is truly important to have.
Yes.
But we're in excess of $2 billion in that fund.
Sure.
At some point,
the rain's starting to fall. At least it's starting to sprinkle a little bit right now.
I guess my question is, what rainy day are we waiting for?
Sure, exactly.
I think we can shift some of that money and help some of these programs, not just education. I mean, I want to make sure I speak for other things too, because there's job and family services, there's children's services, like talked about the opiate situation. I know the police departments and fire departments receive some money from this. Those are all very important things. So at some point, let's pull some of that rainy day money out. Let's make sure our programs stay intact and solid. That makes Ohio such a really great state, because you can continue to build that rainy day fund and you continue to get it back up to whatever level he wants it to.
Sure.
But still use some of that money for the needs that are pressing now. Again, I'm probably speaking as a layman. I don't understand everything. But again, the numbers they keep saying, Jim, an old saying that my dad taught me, I never forgot it, is, figures lie and liars figure. So exactly. I guess I'm a little tired of hearing about the different numbers everybody's putting together.
Tim Meisters, I guess. As always, when Tim comes over, we get into some issues that maybe everybody else doesn't want to talk about, but we're going to talk about. And I think that's important, too, at this point in time. I think it's time for, as you started out with, not only the politicians, but the people that are listening to us right now, the everyday person that's walking. I think part of our problem is that the average guy thinks he can't influence what's going on in Columbus or in Washington. So we've just given up and we've gotten busy with something else, or we're so busy on the phone with the Facebook and the Twitter and everything else that we're losing track of some of these things. And that's another change I think we need to make in our lives too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we elect these people. We've been very fortunate in our area. When it was Tony Berkeley, now it's Craig Rydell from Defiance, Rob McCauley, and Senator Cliff Height. Those guys have always been very open. And they've always said, contact us. And every time I've contacted, for the most part, they have always reached back to me. So we're lucky in our area that we have these people. But like you said, Jim, if you have the resource and they're willing to listen, but you don't reach out and talk to them, then that's shame on you. And so I don't know if it's like that in every part of the state. I'm guessing it's not. But even in Open and Clear area with Representative Reineke and Representative Gardner, those guys have been super and understand the importance of Northwest Ohio. And they want to protect the validity of it. So as you said, reach out, talk to those guys because they're willing to listen.
Is it lip service? Do you find that you're just getting lip service out of these guys most of the time, or is there real follow through with the concerns that you'll have?
I would say 90% of the time, they get back to me and something is done if it's legitimate.
Sure.
So for me, I make sure that I'm not talking to those guys all the time. If I make a phone call or I send an email, it's a legitimate issue. And I always tell them, I'm not calling you to complain because you hear it too much. Here's my concern, and I need to get more information. I need to make you see it from where our perspective is, and I need to see it from where your perspective is because I can't make a good decision unless I have all the information. So I would say for the most part, especially with Rob McCauley and Craig Rydell, those guys have been absolutely terrific about getting back to me. If something doesn't happen, they give me a legitimate reason why. And I'll probably get in a little trouble for saying this. When Cliff first became a senator, very much like that. I think as he has been down there, he's become more established. Cliff is on more committees, so he doesn't nearly get back to me near as much. But in all defense of Cliff, I also know he's been put in charge of a lot more things. So I think that's the nature of the beast when you become a veteran senator or a veteran state rep.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Your time gets a little more scarce.
It does.
You have too many things on your plate oftentimes.
It does.
All right, Tim Meister's our guest. We need to pay some bills because we're just like you. If there's no money coming in, they don't keep paying me, and I don't keep showing up at 9 o'clock in the morning. How's that? So we'll step away, and I really want to get in a little deeper to those tiers, some of the ideas that they're seeing, that you see on the state side, that they think are important, and also the things that you think are important. So as folks watch what happens over the course of the next couple of weeks and days and months, they'll get a feel for whether things are heading in the right direction as far as what we're concerned about. 9:30 right here on the Q. We'll step away for just a couple of minutes. I've got Tim Meister with me right now from the 4 County Career Center, and we're talking education here on the Q.
4 generations of the Krill family have served this area. Krill Funeral Service realizes that the end can be
yeah, and I think they get there for a while too, and they get involved with a lot of things, and they lose their focus a little bit.
Cliff has no focus right now. He is trying to jump on the John Husted bandwagon.
Yeah, okay.
Because he thinks John's going to appoint him to a cabinet seat.
Yeah. So, see, and that is the part that's so frustrating too, you know, to watch these guys in their power struggles all the time. How are we going to do this?
The legislators passed a bill that schools don't have. You don't have a minimum number of days now. You have to go to a minimum number of hours.
Okay. Tim Meister from the 4 County Career Center, and Tim always comes in and we kind of talk about some of the hot issues that are going on right at this point in time around the state of Ohio and education. Let's get into, first of all, where we kind of stopped. When they start to look at this budget nowadays and we start to evaluate on your side, what are the key programs from a superintendent side that you see, and then how are they now responding to that on this tiered legislation?
Yeah, so there's 5 tiers that they have created for the funding piece, and the whole idea was they took the in-need jobs, the in-need skill sets, and those programs got the most funding because that way you could attract more students, you could update your equipment, things of that nature. So right now, in the state of Ohio, manufacturing, any manufacturing program, agriculture, any ag program, welding, those types of things, they're considered quote-unquote tier 5s, and that's where the most money would come from.
Okay.
The lower ones are like your family consumer sciences, which is old guys, we used to call home ec. Those are the lower tiered ones. And then in between you have anything and everything from, networking, technology, pre-engineering, whatever it may be. So it's interesting because I'm not sure how they ever developed the formula in determining what programs are tier 5 versus what programs are tier 1. But I find it interesting that family consumer science is the lowest, and yet one of the things we often hear about is the living skills are out of the schools, balancing your checkbook, learning how to cook, learning how to sew, the old industrial arts classes, learning how to read a tape measure, things like that. Those are the things you hear often from businesses that are the lacking skills, but yet those programs who teach that tend to be the ones on the lower tiered. But again, I understand you have to pick something. Something's got to be a tier 5, something's got to be a tier 4. So all in all, I don't have any issues with the tiered funding. I think they probably do the best. Not everything can be tier 5, not everything can be tier 1.
Sure.
So for the most part, Jim, I like the thought process of the tiers as long as I keep it outside of the foundation money.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to go that way? What's the leaning right now, or we're going to find that here in the next 72 hours?
Yeah, I think what it's going to come down to is, can that stay on the table without a sacred cow taking it over?
Okay.
If it can, I think they'll maintain the funding outside of the state foundation, so actually get the extra. If they put it within the guarantee, that just tells me that there was something that the Senate wanted and the House said we're willing to sacrifice it because we want this and they want that and they want that off the table. So that'll be the compromise. And typically that's how budgets get worked out.
Sure. And that's the only way you can work out a budget, no doubt about that.
It is, and it's one of the things I always try to remind myself is everybody wants more money out of the budget.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
No one calls their state rep or their senator and says, you know what, you're giving me way too much.
Yeah.
Give me a little less this year and I'll be okay with that. So it's one of those things where, I know they have to balance it. I just, again, want to make sure that the balancing is done logically and it is done with the right intentions, and it's not done with backdoor deals and compromises and trade-offs. That's where I think you get yourself into trouble.
Sure. If indeed we go away from the tier structure, how does that influence a school system like yours?
We will lose some money because our higher end programs, the tiered programs, we're pretty full. Our welding program is full.
Sure. Well, gosh, there's welding jobs every day. They cannot get enough welders in this world right now.
Our diesel mechanics program is full. Our ag diesel program is full. Those are all things that are top tiered funding. So if you just say that's going to just get lumped in with the guarantee, we're going to lose some money. The other thing that's on the table, and again, it's very hard to understand if you're not in this every day. I am, and I'm not sure I understand it, Jim, but we have so much money the state gives us that it consider career tech money.
Okay.
75% of that money has to be spent on equipment or career tech things. Okay? 25% of it can be spent on utilities, salary, benefits, things like that. The last budget, that got wiped out, which will allow us as a school more flexibility of how to use that money.
Sure.
Governor Kasich pulled that out and line item vetoed it.
Okay.
No explanation given. We don't know why to this day. Both sides have that back in, that the 75-25 would go away. That would be a huge benefit to us. I think that will go through, but I'm interested to see what happens when he's allowed to line item veto things out of the budget.
Yeah.
So those are the two things that I'm very curious about.
When you got to a situation where they gave you 75-25, they gave you a percentage and said, here's how you have to have it.
Yep.
Did you end up with a surplus then in one of those line items? I'm accustomed to a city budget,
right.
Okay?
Yep.
And there were times when you thought, okay, we're going to spend $100,000 over here and $75,000 over here, and you missed your guess, but you couldn't move money at that point.
Right. And here's a situation that we run into is that we may have a year where we don't need to spend 75% of the career tech money they send us on equipment.
Sure.
But they're forcing us to do that, and if you don't spend 75% on it, you get a reduction the following year.
Yeah.
So what we do is we monitor that every day. We take a look at what our needs are, what we are. So when we get to June 1st and we have 30 days left in our fiscal year, we are so close to that 75% that for us, that's a priority and that we hit it. I think the question that I ask myself always, though, is we're sure spending a lot of time making sure we hit that 75%.
Sure.
Where if you just say, here's the money for career tech, you must spend it on career tech, but how you choose to spend it on career tech is up to you. Just make sure you track it. So that's a really important piece of the budget for us. As I said before, I'm really curious to see if that stays in or if he line item vetoes it one more time.
Yeah, that is interesting. We expect a decision when? I mean, when
it's got to be signed by June 30th.
Okay.
If it's not signed by June 30th at midnight, until it's signed, state shuts down.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, we almost had that situation in Washington, I believe, earlier in the year when they had that.
Yes.
So and people always question why they push it to this late. This is the same. This is almost my 30th year in education, Jim. every year is June 30th.
Yeah.
Every biennial budget, every 2 years, I know June 30th, there's going to be a mad scramble, and it'll end up on his desk.
It'll get done.
It'll get done.
You know,
It'll get done.
There's no doubt about
yeah,
that.
yeah. And one thing you have to understand is those reps and senators, they bust their tail on this budget.
Yeah.
I mean, that literally consumes them until that budget is signed. It's not an easy thing, and I always have a great amount of respect because that is tough because you can't make everyone happy and you have to balance it. And for the most part, our budget's been balanced.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting, very interesting. And you know, there was always a thought that in government, people tried to look for ways to spend money. You had a budget, you got to hit that 75% number, you got to hit that 25% number. So down at the end, we better buy T-shirts and you know, do whatever,
Right.
take a trip,
Right.
take a vacation. I don't think anybody's budget is like that anymore. There are no excess dollars that we're working with on anybody's line items, are there?
No, absolutely. I would think especially when you are dependent like we are on two things. You're on tax revenue, you know, for levies that we pass, and then on state money. We have, at least in the last 20 years, I'm sure prior to that, we have become so synonymous with penny pinching.
Yes.
There isn't a lot of excess. We don't do a lot of frivolous things because the last thing you want to do as a superintendent is to have to go back to your taxpayers year after year after year and ask for levies. So we have become a very conservative group as schools, which is good. You know, still trying to maintain a quality workforce because you want to attract quality teachers. How do you attract quality teachers? You got to have a good set of salary and benefits, but at the same time, you need to have your funds go towards student achievement. So we have become really financial watchdogs, I think, for the taxpayers' money. And speaking for myself, it's a conversation our treasurer and I have, literally, Jim, every week. Are we doing the right thing with our monies to making sure we're serving our kids to the best of our ability?
Yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you what, I've seen that with a number of school systems that we're involved with. I think that is the focus of every superintendent of every school system around here and every treasurer
Yeah.
as well. They're doing the best to get the most out of every penny that they have at this point.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I chuckle when people say, oh, you're just going to go back for a levy again.
Yeah.
I have never met a superintendent where they have said, boy, I hope I get to put up a levy this year. I mean, that's really good stuff, and I just enjoy the heck out of it.
It's like you don't have anything else to do because most people, I think, they don't understand all the work and effort that goes into
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
And you already have a busy day. You already have a full calendar going on. Now you've got to throw
Yeah.
in an extra 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours a day to try to figure out how I'm going to earn enough money to keep the doors open.
Oh, it does. And trying to pass a levy consumes you.
Yes.
And there's so many little things about that people don't understand. For example, you as a superintendent, you cannot work on a levy during your contractual hours.
Really?
It's against the law.
Oh my
So everything you do has to be outside of your school day, with the exception of if a group like a Rotary or a Lions or a Kiwanis would come and ask you to speak and the levy situation would come up. That you can do. But to campaign for it, to put up signs for it, to present things to your students during the school day, it is completely illegal to do. So it's one of those things where when that levy situation is going on, that from 4 o'clock to 10 o'clock every night, your day is consumed.
Yeah, that's amazing. There is a push from Washington right now to try to push everything back towards the states, try to push everything back towards a local situation. That seems on the surface to be maybe a smart idea because we here locally would have a better feel for what's going on. I always have a worry that will the dollars, the added responsibility that comes with added dollars.
Right.
And the added dollars come from where? At that point in time.
We have about only 7% of our funding at Florida County is tied to any federal dollars.
Okay.
The rest of it is local funded or tax dollars and state foundation. One of the interesting things is people understand or forget that our Constitution says education is the rights of the states.
Yes.
That the federal government should not even be involved in education. Now, our federal government over the years has become involved. And what they're saying is you don't have to follow any of our mandates, but we're going to tie every ounce of federal money if you don't follow our mandates. So it's kind of a backdoor way they've gotten in. And I thought that was one of the very cool things with the presidential election, that both President Trump and Marco Rubio said the first thing they would do is disband the the federal education department.
Yes.
Because they have no rights. It should be the rights of the states, and that's where it should go.
Yes.
I don't know if Senator Rubio would have followed through, but I know when President Trump got elected, then he went polar opposite. Instead of disbanding it, he hired this Secretary of Education, DeVos, who is completely against public schools. And she is all about privatization and charter schools and things of that nature. So in a perfect world, Jim, you're right. The feds would say, this is the money we pass down to the states for education. It's not a lot, but that is our part. But the rights and the decisions belong to the states. That's how it should be.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100% because I don't think the federal government has no idea what is the best interest of the students in Northwest Ohio. No way.
No, and what no one likes to say, but the truth is that the education of a student in Appalachia, Ohio is going to look different than the education of a student in Bryan, Ohio, and that's going to look different than the education of the student in Toledo, Ohio. And everybody thinks that's unequal. No, it's just how you educate those students is going to look different because they come from different backgrounds. So back when I started teaching, it was a beautiful model. You had 50 states, and they all had 50 different ways of doing things, and unbelievable how it worked. And then all of a sudden, we got in this comparison with, well, the Japanese are doing this, the Chinese are doing this, the Finnish are doing this. Well, we're still the only country who tries to give the same education to every kid ages 5 through 18. Yeah. Everybody else has a career path or a track, or they're pushing them in a different direction by the time they're 12 or 13. And so I don't think the comparisons are very fair, but that's what's driven the federals to get involved. And now what we have 50 cookie cutter states all trying to educate kids in the same fashion. And I'm sorry, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. A farmer in Michigan and a farmer in Ohio and a farmer in California, they're not using the exact same methods.
Sure.
But the end result is they want a fruitful, bountiful crop. It's the same thing in education.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Tim Meister's our guest. We need to step away again. Tim, real quick, pay some bills. It's about 9:45 here on the Q, 96.5 FM. brings up on the education program that we do every Tuesday morning from 9 o'clock till 10, and I have Tim Meister here. You know, when we first started talking about this, Tim, and doing this program, and we're just in our early stages, it was the same thing that Phil Ennin told me a while ago. How are we going to spend an hour talking about the healthcare? You know, how are you going to spend an hour talking about education? Okay. We seem to do it.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, the landscape is ever changing, so the discussion this month may be different than the discussion next month, but the topics may be identical.
Exactly. And you know what? That's, I think, for what we're trying to do, and that's what we're attempting to do with these programs, is to get back to I think something that's missing. Because when I grew up, when you grew up, there were programs like this going on all the time. People were a little more tuned in.
Right.
What's going on? What's happening right now? I want to hear this. Give me a little more explanation. Why is that Meister guy doing what he's doing over there? Why is that Stuckey guy doing what he's doing over there? You know, why is Diana Savage doing what she's doing here? Okay, we've gotten away from those programs and talking about those issues. And at times we think, oh my gosh, they have no focus. They have no idea what they're doing. When you start to hear all the things and all the jobs that you have to take care of in the course of a day and the hats you've got to wear,
right,
I think people start to understand, whoa, hold a minute. It's not quite as easy as what we think it might be. And that's where I want to turn this thing to right now, because the one universal theme I think we've heard from educators that have been on this program right now is that the testing idea. We put kids through tests, and we teach kids to pass tests. We don't educate kids in a lot of cases anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. You're forcing teachers to teach to a test. Mm-hmm. People sometimes misconstrue that as we don't want accountability. I have zero issue with accountability. You should hold us as school systems as accountable as possible. But the misnomer is testing is the absolute best way to do it.
Yes. Because
all you're doing is you're capturing how that student felt and how that student reacted on that day of that test. We are so over-tested that right now we had more days at Fort County that we actually had tests on that day than days that we didn't have tests.
Wow.
That's incredible. And we have to, it's not a choice, we have to do that. And for Career Centers, Jim, we're under a little different scrutiny because we not only have all the testing the other schools have, the home schools have, but our kids also have to take a web exam, which is driven by the Department of Education, which no one cares about, but they force us to take it. And if our kids want to get their industry credential, they have to take an exam or a test that industry provides. So not only are we tested on everything else, but we're also tested on those two items. So it's just it's a trend in education that I don't like. But our new state superintendent, Paolo DiMario, he has made a strong statement and told the Board of Education at the state level, we need to do away with much of this testing because it's not holding anybody accountable. And you are not truly judging whether or not that student is gaining the knowledge he or she needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And it goes back again to something we touched on a little while ago. Now, because we're so focused on that testing, there are a number of social issues and just common sense issues and day-to-day maturation, I guess, that we don't have time to play with. A kid doesn't know how to balance his checkbook.
Right.
All right. So he's got a great paycheck and he passed all the tests, but he's always broke. He's always got no money in his checkbook because he has no idea how to deal with something as simple as that.
What we're doing, Jim, is we're creating a student that's a test taker.
Yes.
We're not creating a student who can take that knowledge and apply it. That's one of the neat things we have at the Career Center is, even though we're doing the testing and it drives us nuts, our math people are still talking to that welding kid, that carpentry kid, that auto kid, the computer software kid. How does this apply to the profession that you're eventually going to have? And we try to make it applicable. But it's really tough because, again, we have a culture of test takers, and teachers are trying to teach students the material and how to take the test because, let's face it, the results of the test will lead to either praise or criticism of that school system.
Sure. And it doesn't, it really doesn't reflect how that young person is going to fit into society and do that job. Okay, it just means that, how many tests do you take every day when you're out welding? Your test is, did you do that job well, and is it going to hold up, and is it going to be there for the next 50 years? There's the test.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
And those are the kind of tests almost that we need to be into. The heck with sitting down with a piece of paper and a pencil and trying to spit back what I just told you. How are you really fitting into this world at this point in time?
Right, and at some point when you're a student and you're exposed over the course of your high school career to close to 12 to 16 different tests. At what point do you say, I'm tired of taking tests? I know, but I'm tired of taking it. We hear that from our kids, like, oh, another test?
Yeah.
Well, you have to. And if you don't take it and you don't get a certain number of points, you can't graduate. So we just put too much emphasis on it. I'm not against testing, and I'll probably get in trouble with some of my superintendent cohorts for saying that. But I'm not against testing, I'm against accountability. But not everything comes down to a test. Like I said, what you capture is that day and that small amount of time period on that student. You know, does he have problems at home? Did he eat breakfast that day? Did he have a place to sleep last night?
Sure.
You know, it's just all kinds of things.
Is he just tired of taking tests?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, has he just gotten to that point where it's like, okay,
right.
You know what?
Right.
I don't want to do this today. You know, we all do that.
But as long as the state board accepts Superintendent DeMario's recommendation and our legislators support it, I do think we're moving in the right direction. And I think there is a realization that we are just way over tested, and that's not good for anyone. Now,
you are out for the summer right now. Kind of.
The students and teachers are. I am still there.
When does school start up again?
So for us, our teacher work days are, I believe, August 15th and 16th, and students come on that Wednesday. And we are in the process right now of wrapping up 2017, 16-17. Our fiscal year ends this month, so we are getting that. We've already started making preparations for next year. Our master schedule's done. We're slotting students in, you know, shifting some things. We got a couple of hires going on. And then once July 1 hits, that's when our purchase orders for all of our supplies can start to go out. And really, Jim, once July hits, it just becomes the next school year. For us, it's just full steam ahead. So
they just blend together, though, don't they?
They do. They really do. And I think that's one thing for me when I was a teacher, then an athletic director, then a coach, and even as a principal. When that school year ended, I had a amount of time that I was off,
right,
and that brought an end to it. And so I could walk away in July or the middle of June and say, okay, my stuff's ready. As a superintendent, it blends. It really just truly blends. And that's not a complaint at all, because it just makes you have a little bit of a different perspective that there is no beginning and end and then a beginning. It just rolls right into one.
Yeah. Do we ever get, from your opinion, into a situation where we are more like a year-round school system?
Honestly, I think it would be the best thing that we could do. And when we say year-round, I think people, again, maybe misconstrue what we mean.
Sure.
But I would love to go, for example, 12 weeks on,
right,
2 or 3 weeks off, 12 weeks on, 2 or 3 weeks off. And those 2 or 3 weeks off, you take those students who may have struggled in a subject, and you take a week or two, and you do some remediation and some intervention with those students.
Yes.
You know, and then you come back for your next 12-week cycle. You have less time off from the summer. Our higher-end students, even at Florida County, our school, is the same thing. They struggled because they said there was such a gap between May 31st and August 15th. When they went from pre-calc to calc, they had to spend the first 2 weeks trying to recall what they learned in pre-calc. So I think if you shorten that time, the retention piece would become less of an issue. Personally, I am for it. I think the 12 weeks, and then you give kids a couple weeks off and do some intervention. It refreshes them. They come back. Same thing. To me, that would be an ideal calendar.
I've got 2 grandkids in this town right now, and they get bored over the summer. You know, they really do. They like going to school.
Right.
They like being there every day. They like being with their friends. They like the education. They like where they're at. All those kind of good things. And over the course of about 3 or 4 weeks, all of a sudden that summer the shine wears off that bush, you know. And again, you're trying to find a place for them. You're trying to find a babysitter for them. You have a program to put them into, something to deal with. I've always thought that was probably a really good idea.
Yeah, it is. And we would have to get everyone on the same page,
sure,
you know, obviously, because you just can't have one school go rogue and do it.
Yeah.
You know, and you have athletics play a part in this too, you know, when 2-a-days for football are and when seasons are. But I don't think it's a problem that's unworkable. And truly, I think our kids would benefit from it. I think it would be a very ideal situation. But I've been saying that for about 10 years, and I'll just keep saying it.
That could be your goal before you retire. You're still a young fella. You still have some time ahead of you. That could be the cause you can champion.
Jim, my younger days are getting far behind me, I'm afraid. It goes on.
I understand the problem. Tim Meister has been our guest today, the superintendent over at Ford County, and I'll tell you what, I always appreciate your time and your insight. We'll be watching that budget, and it's going to be fun to see what happens in the next couple of days, because the 30th is what, Friday?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so by Friday, They have to, or let's see, today's the 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, yeah, Friday.
It must be signed by
Must be signed and done
midnight at Friday.
Friday, see how
yeah.
that all works out.
And from everything I've read, Jim, it's going to happen. I mean, there's not a massive gap or chasm in what both sides want. I really think it's just a matter of working out the fine-tuned details. And I'm guessing, again, this is just my guess, that Governor Casey's office has told them, I want this thing, and I don't want it at 11:58 p.m.
Sure.
You know, I want it because there will be some things that I know are very important to him that he will either put in or line 9 and veto out.
Yeah, no doubt about that. All right, we'll talk to you in about a month there, my friend.
Great, thank you. Appreciate it.
Get a day or two off between now and then. We hit a golf ball or do something like that.
I will attempt to do that.
Tim Meister, our guest, as we wrap up our educational program for Tuesday.